Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. Our book is The World of Philosophy, an introductory reader by Stephen Kahn. And we are now starting the videos in preparation for exam 3, which is organized a little differently than the previous two exams. So part A, the questions are very general. There's 4 questions. And question 1 is, which of the views on the relation of mind and body, part 4a, do you think presents the best argument? Why and explain. So part 4 of the book is called Reality. If you look in the table of contents, and then it's got 4 subdivisions, A, B, C, and D. Subdivision A is mind and body, the mind-body problem. How does the mind interact with the body? What's mind made of? Is it different than matter? And if so, how do they interact? So part B is the self. We'll be discussing Hinduism and Buddhism. Then section C is called identity. What is a individual personal self? So these categories seem to me a little bit like they could be bleeding into each other. At any rate, category D is free will. So we'll be going over, I'm not going to create a video for each and every single one of these readings because there's a whole lot of them and it's a lot of freedom of choice for you. So in this video, I'm going over the mind-body problem as described by Paul Churchland, starting on page 109. And it's one of the longer essays, and I think if I get into some of the details of his argument, you'll have enough background to understand the other articles about the mind-body problem, which deals with a lot of the same issues as what is a self, what is free will. So at any rate, let me get into this. Now, this is the first time I've read this article. So every time we get a new book, to keep the costs down, the problem is I've got a lot of new material I've got to learn. So I wish I had more time to read through this a few more times, but I don't have that kind of time, and I want to give you something to work with for the exam. So I'm just going to get into this on page 109. So the mind-body problem, Churchland is a materialist. He believes consciousness comes from matter and that it can be explained through Darwinian evolution. But he addresses the alternative view that mind is different than matter. He traces that belief back to René Descartes. It's a much more ancient belief than that, but in the modern world, René Descartes, and I already put up a video about him, I think, therefore I am. That's René Descartes' basic point. I am a thinking substance. I'm separate from the non-thinking material substance, which is extended in space. I'm a thinking substance that's not extended in space and that somehow interacts with physical substance. And that's a problem. How does a non-physical substance interact with a physical substance? You will to raise your hand, it goes up. You put your hand near a hot light bulb, you feel heat. How is the mind interacting with the body? How is the body interacting with the mind? That's a problem to this day. So Churchland calls that dualism. And he believes that there are not 2 different types of substances, but there's only one type, matter. And, I think what I'll do is I'll start with his concluding paragraph, so you know where he's working towards. And there's 10 pages. It's dense reading, so I'm going to be moving kind of quickly. It's an introductory class. You just need to have a basic awareness of the fundamental issues. So I will read here on page 118, the right-hand column. What is the origin of a complex and sophisticated species such as ours? What, for that matter, is the origin of the dolphin, the mouse, or the housefly? Thanks to the fossil record, comparative anatomy, and the biochemistry of proteins and nucleic acids, there's no longer any significant doubt on this matter. Okay, there's not significant doubt in his mind. There is significant doubt in my mind and a lot of other people. Each existing species is a surviving type from a number of variations on an earlier type of organism. Each earlier type is in turn a surviving type from a number of variations on a still earlier type of organism, and so on down the branches of the evolutionary tree until some 3 billion years ago, we find a trunk of just one or a handful of very simple organisms. These organisms, like their more complex offspring, are just self-repairing, self-replicating, energy-driven molecular structures. That's all they are. They are just that and nothing more. So says Churchland. That evolutionary trunk has its own roots in an earlier era of purely chemical evolution in which the molecular elements of life were themselves pieced together. The mechanism of development that has structured this tree has two main elements: the occasional blind variation in types of reproducing creature, and two, the selective survival of some of these types due to the relative reproductive advantage enjoyed by individuals of those types. Over periods of geological time, such a process can produce an enormous variety of organisms, some of them very complex indeed. All right, so this is standard evolutionary story of the human species, he says, and this is what explains consciousness. We have a nervous system, he says, but a nervous system is just an active matrix of cells, and a cell is just an active matrix of molecules. He uses this word just. That's all it is. So he's saying there's only one type of substance, matter, and its evolution accounts for consciousness. We are notable only in that our nervous system is more complex and powerful than those of our fellow creatures. We are, he says, creatures of, all right, if this is the correct account of our origins, then there seems neither need nor room to fit any non-physical substances or properties into our theoretical account of ourselves. We are creatures of matter, and we should learn to live with that fact. Arguments like these have moved most, but not all, of the professional community to embrace some form of materialism. This has not produced much unanimity, however, since the differences between the several materialists' positions are even wider than the differences that divide dualism. Okay, so if this is the correct account of our origins, then there seems neither need nor room to fit any non-physical substances or properties into our theoretical account of ourselves. We are creatures of matter. All right, but is that a correct account of our origins? So the Darwinian theory can be broken down into two premises. The first one, which Darwin himself didn't make, is that consciousness comes from matter. There were, neo-Darwinism, the current standard version of Darwinism that most academics believe in, says that the universe began with the Big Bang. Even that is very controversial, because what is a gravitational singularity? And I'm going to talk about that because Paul Churchland talks about these things. So this is why I chose this article, because it covers most of the bases, and it also gives me a platform from which to provide some answers to these questions. He's presenting these scientific facts and talking about complicated things like quantum physics and general relativity and neo-Darwinism. But let me just, as a kind of a precursor here, this is a book I wrote, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology and Holographic String Theory. This was based on my dissertation. I got a PhD in philosophy and religion with a concentration in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness from the California Institute of Integral Studies. So what Churchland is talking about here was the specific focus of my dissertation. So I felt obliged to respond in a little more detail to his articles than I will be to others. Some of the things that I'll be talking about in response to Churchland were also brought up by Barbara Montero, The Body Problem, which starts on page 130, and I'll go over that also briefly in another video. But so basically the neo-Darwinian understanding of consciousness is that everything began with the Big Bang. I said there's some controversy there, but the Big Bang gave birth to all the energy. Eventually particles formed. Those particles interacted in the vastness of space over enormous amounts of time. And through the miracle of chance, self-replicating living cells were created, DNA on our planet. suppose it could have been other forms of self-replicating chemical organisms on other planets, and then through the process of random mutation and natural selection, the DNA molecule mutates. Most of the time mutations are not helpful, and that mutation will cause the animal to die, or the plant or the microbe or whatever form of life it is. But sometimes the mutation just so happens to provide an advantage for survival, and so it gets reproduced, and that's the essence of evolution. Okay, there are some problems with that theory, though. It makes good sense in the context of Newtonian physics, which says that the universe is an infinite space of 3 dimensions, up, down, left, right, backward, and forward, that are rigid and stable. They don't change. They're just rigid emptiness. Linear time. Time flows forward everywhere at the same rate, at a constant rate, regardless of how fast you're moving or what direction you're moving. And then these little point particles that float around in this empty space. Little ball bearings of insentient matter, extended in space a tiny bit, and they interact. That's Newtonian physics. It works very well in the realm of perception that humans occupy. But if you get down to the microscopic level, it doesn't work anymore. Down to the level of the atom. If you go to the large level of the galaxies, or if you go to the speed of light, again, Newton's physics don't work. For things that are very small, you need quantum mechanics. For things that are very big and heavy and move very swiftly, you need relativity theory, which has special relativity and general relativity. The problem with that evolution of physics in the 20th century, don't worry, I'm bringing this all back to this text because Churchland talks about these things, is that you can't use relativity theory in the realm of the very tiny. You can't use quantum mechanics in the realm of the very large and fast. You would think there's one nature, there should be one law of physics that applies everywhere, up and down at all scales, but there's not unless you believe in string theory, which unites those two, quantum mechanics and general relativity, which is Einstein's theory of gravity. It unites them, and furthermore, it brings us back to a philosophy, a cosmology, within which the idea of an eternal soul was recounted by Plato in the West and by the Hindu philosophers, the Vedanta philosophers of India. Because this is what string theory says. Leonard Susskind, a Stanford string theorist, he defeated Stephen Hawking. Leonard Susskind and his partner Gerard 't Hooft, a Nobel Prize winning physicist, they defeated Stephen Hawking in the Black Hole War by saying that, in a nutshell, the ultimate conclusion was this: the entire history of the universe is a sphere radiating out from the gravitational singularity. Space-time expands at the speed of light until it expands at an exponential rate. It reaches the speed of light at this outermost sphere called the cosmic horizon. String theory says every bit of information describing the past, present, and future of the three-dimensional volume of the universe is superimposed at each point of this outermost sphere, and it radiates back in on these fundamental elastic threads of energy to create the holographic movie, the holographic cinema of what we call the material world. Okay, I know that was a lot, but I needed to lay that down to counteract some of the arguments that Paul Churchland makes in the mind-body problem. Because he's saying there isn't mind which is separate from body. Everything comes from matter through evolution. But he doesn't have a very firm grasp of what matter is. He brings up the problems with defining matter, and he just kind of leaves them to the side, which is a big oversight in people who tend to argue the same type of materialist, physicalist philosophy that he does. Richard Dawkins, he's a famous advocate of Darwinism. He has a sharp tongue for people who don't accept that philosophy. But when confronted with the problem of defining matter, having to discuss, for example, quantum mechanics, his answer is that those issues are, in his words, queerer than we can suppose. they're so bizarre and they're so outside our normal range of comprehension that we should just put them aside, which to me is very weak argument of why we should not consider the implications of 20th century physics because they're too complicated. My suspicion is that he puts them aside because they so obviously undermine the foundation of the materialist philosophy. So let's not look at the evidence because that would really undermine the idea that everything can be reduced to these little ball bearings of insentient matter that exist whether you are observing them or not. Because that theory was overthrown beginning in 1905 with Einstein's special relativity, and every step along the way in 20th century physics undermined the Newtonian presuppositions of Darwinism more and more. So with that, now we're 15 minutes into it, and I've only read one paragraph, but we needed this kind of a background. So Paul M. Churchland, he's writing, this is his book, Matter and Consciousness. This is the mind-body problem. He starts by talking about substance dualism, and he brings up René Descartes. So René Descartes, he says there's two types of substance: thinking substance that is not extended in space, and unthinking substance, which is matter, which is extended in space. Okay, so on the left-hand column of page 110, he says, first, Descartes thought that he could determine by direct introspection alone that he was essentially a thinking substance and nothing else. And second, he could not imagine how a purely physical system could ever use language in a relevant way or engage in mathematical reasoning as any normal human can. That part of Descartes' philosophy we did not cover in this book, but that was his argument. How could you tell if you were talking to a sophisticated automaton? So he was writing in the 1500s, in the 1600s, born 1596, died 1650. So he saw automatons like on clocks, intricate robots that would gong the bell in a system of gears and chains or however they were constructed. He says, well, imagine a really sophisticated one that looks like a human. How would you be able to tell if it was a human or not? He said, just have a conversation. After a while, you'd see, because this machine lacks reason, it wouldn't be able to respond in a believable way to your conversation. It might be pre-programmed in a bunch of ways to respond, but eventually you'd be able to tell. Alan Turing used the same reasoning for how we'll be able to tell when a computer has reached the level of artificial intelligence. Have a conversation with it via, emails back and forth. He didn't use the word emails, but in a way that you couldn't tell if you're interacting with a human or not through a teleprompter or something like that. If you had a conversation back and forth and you couldn't tell it's a machine, then that is a self-aware or an intelligent machine. Okay, and Churchland brings up the idea that Descartes' claim that non-rational material machines would never be able to use reason, such as math, seems to be disproven by the existence of calculators, that we can do these sophisticated mathematical calculations with machines. All right, now this is one of the reasons I wish I had more time to read through this and develop a response, but it seems to me that doesn't seem like a strong argument because those calculators were programmed by rational human beings. That if you take the rational human being out of the equation with the existence of that, the calculators wouldn't exist without a rational human programming them to help with the rational procedures of mathematical reasoning. They can't do it themselves. So I'll leave that alone and just mention that. As I said, I'm just going to go over some of the basic points to give you some seeds to develop an answer if you choose to discuss Churchland's article. Okay, so over on the right-hand column, page 110, if mind stuff is so utterly different from matter stuff in its nature, different to the point that it has no mass, whatever, no shape, whatever, and no position anywhere in space, then how is it possible for my mind to have any causal influence on my body at all? All right, so that was a problem with Descartes' philosophy. How's the interaction of a non-material substance and a material substance explained? Where is this interacting point? Churchland brings up that Descartes mentioned animals, spirits, very subtle material energy connecting the spiritual energy or the soul and the matter in the material body, but still, that doesn't solve the problem. How are the animal spirits related to the soul is still to be dealt with. So in the second paragraph, right-hand column, 110, in any case, the basic principle of division used by Descartes is no longer as plausible as it was in his day. It is now neither useful nor accurate to characterize ordinary matter as that which has extension in space. Electrons, for example, are bits of matter, but our best current theories describe the electron as a point particle with no extension whatever. It even lacks a determinate spatial position. And according to Einstein's theory of gravity, an entire star can achieve the same status if it undergoes a complete gravitational collapse. If there truly is a division between mind and body, it appears that Descartes did not put his finger on the dividing line. Okay, so when I read that, I felt a little stir of excitement because Churchland has touched upon the essence of my dissertation in my book, Psyche equals Singularity. So he mentions the gravitational singularity, a complete gravitational collapse. Descartes said, mind or the soul is thinking substance unextended in space. And matter is unthinking substance extended in space. So Churchland points out, well, an electron is supposed to be a point particle. Well, that's maybe for the purposes of quick calculations, physicists might refer to the electron as a point particle, but they definitely do not say that the electrons have no extension in space. Electrons do have extension in space, it's just very, very tiny. And tinier than that are, according to string theorists, are these fundamental strings from which electrons, protons, and all of the subatomic particles are made. They're so small, say the string theorists, that there's no empirical observing, there's no mechanical observing device which would enable us to observe these strings. They're too tiny. You would need too much energy to produce wavelengths of light tiny enough to detect these tiny, tiny strings. So that is the argument against string theory. It's not an empirical science if you can't observe it with your physical sense organs amplified by observational technologies, but I'm going to get into near-death experiences here, which Churchland talks about on the very next page. But here's an important point. If matter is extended in space, but a singularity is not extended in space, and yet I would think Churchland and most Darwinists believe in the Big Bang theory, but according to that theory, the entire universe was once contained in a point of infinite density. The singularity truly does have no extension in space. The electron does, but when he goes on to point out a complete gravitational collapse of a star, according to Einstein's theory of gravity, that leaves you with a singularity, which is also the origin of the universe at the Big Bang. In this book, I argue that is what Descartes calls the soul. It is the thinking substance not extended in space. And that is a very radical claim to make. I base it on the psychologist Carl Jung's equation for psychic energy. Carl Jung, the protege of Freud, who broke away from Freud with his theory of the collective unconscious, he had dinner with Einstein several times, and he was personal friends with Wolfgang Pauli, one of the founders of quantum physics. So he was aware of general relativity and quantum mechanics. At least he had a basic understanding of those theories from the people who developed them. And he said, well, if psychic energy is energy, then it should have mass, according to Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, which Churchland mentions on page 111. But how come you can't measure psychic energy? And then he came up with this conclusion on Leap Day, 1952, in a letter that he wrote, and he concluded it with the equation psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. The highest intensity would be infinite intensity or infinite density. and the smallest space is zero volume, which is the definition of a gravitational singularity in black holes and at the Big Bang. I'm going to also put up in the same learning module where this video will be, some videos I made about my book, which explain the history of physics from Newton through string theory. In case you're interested, I'm just briefly going over it here, but you can refer to those videos for some more information. But so psyche equals singularity. That's what I derived from Carl Jung's equation, and putting that equation in the place of this mind-body problem solves a lot of the issues. It's not a dualism. It's not saying there's one type of thing, soul, and another type of thing, matter. It's saying that there's only one type of thing. You can call it soul, or you can call it consciousness, or whatever it is. Everything is made out of this singularity. And that what we call matter is a holographic projection from the singularity, which exists in the centralmost point of the universe and at each point of its encompassing sphere. That's according to holographic string theory, which Leonard Susskind developed with the overt intention of supporting the Darwinian materialist theory of consciousness. So he wasn't some kind of a new age person presenting proof of the soul, but I used his theory to do that because I said, well, look, strangely, your theory, holographic string theory, parallels perfectly Plato's cosmology, the Vedanta cosmology of India, both of which we will be talking about in this book, and Carl Jung's near-death experience. So as a matter of fact, let me just read this. This is just so you'll understand why I took this holographic string theory so seriously. This is, I'm reading here from my book, but this is an excerpt from Carl Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. So he's recalling a near-death experience he had in 1944. He broke his foot, he had a heart attack, and then he felt his consciousness rise above his body, above the hospital, above the earth. He saw himself 1,000 miles above the planet Earth. He looked down, he saw the reddish sands of Arabia, cloud formations, the oceans. So his consciousness rose above the planet, and then he had, ultimately, this was his realization, which is very similar, almost exactly the same as Suskind's description of holographic string theory. So here's what Jung says. It seemed to me as if behind the horizon of the cosmos, a three-dimensional world had been artificially built up in which each person sat by himself in a little box. I had been so glad to shed it all, and now it had come about that I, along with everyone else, would again be hung up in a box by a thread. So then later he would wake up an hour after midnight every night for the next 3 weeks, and he would go into these ecstatic visionary experiences, and this is how he described them. We shy away from the word eternal, but I can describe the experience only as the ecstasy of a non-temporal state in which the present, past, and future are one. One is interwoven into an indescribable whole and yet observes it with complete objectivity. So this idea that we are all eternally one with the past, present, and future of the universe at each point of this outermost sphere, and that our embodied lives are like being imprisoned in a little box tethered to the horizon by a thread, that is what holographic string theory says, except holographic string theory does not say that our consciousness exists out at that outermost sphere. But Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli worked together for 25 years until Pauli's death in 1953, or was it 1958? I should know that. Yeah, it was so from 1932 until 1958, Jung and the physicist Pauli, the greatest psychologist, the greatest physicist, in many people's opinions, developed a theory that the laws of psychology should mirror and be mirrored by the laws of physics, because mind and matter both emerge from the same source, which they call the unus mundus, or the God archetype, or the archetype of the self. And that we are all, the individual psyches radiate from this original archetypal psyche. And all the way they describe that archetypal psyche is the same. You can see the parallels with the language that describes the gravitational singularity, both at the Big Bang and inside black holes, and at each point of the quantum vacuum. So I'll briefly mention these concepts throughout these videos, but again, I'll put up a couple of videos that describe it in a more methodical fashion. But Jung and Pauli, this great physicist, said we should seek out a mirror symmetry, parallels between the laws of psychology and physics. Unbeknownst to Susskind, he describes this theory uniting quantum mechanics and general relativity, the holographic string theory, in a way that point for point replays Carl Jung's near-death experience. And in such a way that it solves a lot of the problems that come with the so-called mind-body problem that Churchland is talking about. And here's another thing that we need to keep in mind. Just according to Einstein's theory, which Churchland talks to, and he talks about a star collapsing into a point of infinite density, the past, the present, and the future coexist. So Einstein, he said to himself, right, he imagines people standing at a train station. They're standing on the platform. A train is coming in. It's not stopping. It's speeding on past. Lightning strikes the back and the front of the tracks of the train, just in front and just behind the train simultaneously. But people on the platform see that. Oh, the front strike and the rear strike of lightning happen simultaneously, because it takes the same amount of time for each of them to reach their eyes. But the people on the speeding train see the light strike in the front first, because they're traveling toward it, whereas the light from the rear strike takes some time to travel at 186,000 miles a second to reach them. So from their perspective, the front lightning strike hit first, then the rear lightning strike. So who's correct? The people on the platform who said they happened simultaneously, or the people on the train who said the front hit first, then the back? According to Einstein, they're both correct from their relative reference frames. But you have to account for the speed of the observer and the direction in which they're observing when you make claims such as, what happened before and what happened after, which has huge implications for things like the idea of cause and effect. So I'll just read a little bit here from a current physicist, Brian Greene from Columbia University. He does a lot of television educational programs, which I enjoy. He's written books. He says he's also, like Leonard Susskind, a physicalist, a materialist. He does not believe in a soul. But his belief, like Suskind's and Churchland's, in this Darwinian explanation for consciousness, they know that the past, present, and future coexist, but they don't see how that could possibly affect the theory of evolution from the past to the future. But let me just read what Greene says. Once we know that your now can be what I consider the past, or your now can be what I consider the future, and your now is every bit as valid as my now, then we learn that the past must be real, the future must be real. They could be your now. With this bold insight, Einstein shattered one of the most basic concepts of how we experience time. The distinction between past, present, and future, he once said, is only an illusion, however persistent. So, if the distinction between past, present, and future is only an illusion, then the idea of evolution is also only an illusion, however persistent. And Einstein said that as well. So I believe it was from his book Relativity. I've got the end note here, but I don't want to flip to it for fear of messing up this video. But here's what Einstein says. He says, since there exists in this four-dimensional structure, space-time, no longer any sections which represent now objectively, the concepts of happening and becoming are indeed not completely suspended, but yet complicated. It appears, therefore, more natural to think of physical reality as a four-dimensional existence instead of, as hitherto, the evolution of a three-dimensional existence. And he italicized the word evolution. So there's a four-dimensional space-time continuum, in which the past, present, and future coexist. Just like in front of me in space is there, and behind me in space is there, whether I'm, even though I'm standing right here. Similarly, because space and time are interwoven, the future is there and the past is there, even though I'm in the present. That's what Einstein said. He goes, it's not a case of the evolution of three-dimensional existence, although it does appear to be that way from our empirical bodily sense organs. And looking at a fossil record, it would imply that's the case. But he says it's not. How could it be? The idea of a linear timeline, that is what we perceive with our clumsy sense organs, but our mathematical science, which has been empirically demonstrated to be accurate, or at least it hasn't been disproven yet, shows relativity theory is so far stood up to the tests, so it's more accurate than the claim that what our senses imply, that time is flowing from the past toward the future. Roger Penrose, another Nobel Prize winning physicist, Sir Roger Penrose, he reiterates what Einstein says about evolution. He says, the idea that the history of the universe should be viewed physically as a four-dimensional space-time rather than as a three-dimensional space evolving with time is indeed fundamental to modern physics. So if the entire universe, according to string theory, which unites quantum mechanics and relativity theory, is recorded on a holographic film at the horizon of the cosmos and radiates in on these elastic threads of energy to create this holographic movie, but the whole plot, every point of the history of space-time is pre-recorded. That has a lot to say about the free will problem, but at any rate, it radically undermines the standard version of the Darwinian theory of the essence and origin of consciousness. And Churchland even mentions these problems. He mentions that a point particle with no extension in space, a complete gravitational collapse according to Einstein's theory of gravity on page 110. He mentions them. He says that he says, if there truly is a division between mind and body, it appears that Descartes did not put his finger on the dividing line. Well, at any rate, I think Descartes helped us see what to look for, and this thinking substance with no extension in space, that would be accounted for by if the mind is what the physicists call a gravitational singularity. By the way, Einstein did not like the idea of a gravitational singularity because it's not a physical thing anymore. He wanted a law of physics. That's not physical. Infinite gravity, that means infinite is equivalent to infinite speed. Nothing's supposed to be able to go faster than the speed of light. So there's a lot of the idea of a gravitational singularity throws a monkey wrench into the dualist's perspective. It throws a monkey wrench into the physicalist's perspective. It is this infinitely powerful monster that devours everything, gives birth to everything. But I just want to point out that what Paul Churchland is pointing out here in favor of his physicalist, materialist theory of consciousness does not in any way account for the evolution of physics in the 20th century, which undermines at every point this theory of little bits of matter evolving through empty space, enduring through linear time to create complex material organisms, the epiphenomenal consequences of which are consciousness. It doesn't make sense. It does make sense in a Newtonian cosmology, but it does not make sense in the quantum relativistic cosmology, which is very complicated. I don't blame people for not, I don't blame Richard Dawkins for saying it's queerer than we can suppose. One of the big problems is quantum mechanics doesn't get along with general relativity. So until they get their act together, let's just let them work it out and keep working with what we know. Even though we know it's been overthrown, let's just still keep pretending for the sake of not losing our minds that the Newtonian worldview is still intact, but it's not. It's a very great generalization. It's very useful for everyday kind of activities in the realm that humans perceive, but it is not an accurate description of nature in any fundamental level. And yet, that is the presupposition of Darwinism, And Darwinism is the presupposition of Churchland's argument against dualism, which is why I say Churchland's argument is unenlightened by 20th century physics, which is really what he's talking about. What is matter? And yet you don't bring in the definition of matter according to 20. You briefly bring in E equals mc squared, a complete gravitational collapse, but the implications of space and time and cause and effect completely left to the side, and then just move right back into this Newtonian idea of little ball bearings of matter. All right, so having said that, I'm going to continue to read here. On page 111, left-hand column, so he says, this view need not have the difficulties of Descartes. The mind is right there. So this is what he's talking about, a ghost in the machine. Some dualists could say, okay, there is a non-physical substance, which is consciousness, but it does have extension in space, and it fills up your body like a ghost. It's not material, but it does have spatial extension. And he says, so this view need not have the difficulties of Descartes. The mind is right there in contact with the brain, and their interaction can perhaps be understood in terms of their exchanging energy of a form that our science has not yet recognized or understood. Ordinary matter, you may recall, is just a form or manifestation of energy. You may think of a grain of sand as a great deal of energy condensed or frozen into a small package according to Einstein's relation, E equals mc squared. Perhaps mind stuff is a well-behaved form of manifestation of energy also, but a different form of it. It is thus possible that a dualism of this alternative sort be consistent with familiar laws concerning the conservation of momentum and energy. This is fortunate for dualism, since those particular laws are well established indeed. So this view will appeal to many for the further reason that it at least holds out the possibility, though it does not guarantee, that the mind might survive the death of the body. It does not guarantee the mind's survival, because that kind of energy might require a body, a brain, complex physical structure to endure. Okay, so I'm going to skip down a little bit. Its promise of survival might be a reason for wishing dualism to be true, but it does not constitute a reason for believing that it is true. For that, we would need independent empirical evidence that minds do indeed survive the permanent death of the body, regrettably and despite the exploitative blatherings of the supermarket tabloids. Then he's got in parentheses in capital letters, top docs prove life after death, exclamation point times 3. We possess no such evidence. Well, I disagree. And that top docs prove life after death. I don't know if he was referring to Eben Alexander, but he was a Harvard neurosurgeon who had the same materialist idea of consciousness that Churchland has until he had a near-death experience. And then he wrote a book about it, Proof of Life, I believe it was called. At any rate, I've read his book. It's been a few years now, but here's a brain surgeon. He said this was a perfect storm. I was a doubter of the idea of a separate conscious energy. I'm a member of the elite university and a brain surgeon from Harvard University. I mean, you can't get more intellectually elite than that. And he furthermore wasn't out to prove the existence of a soul, yet he had this near-death experience. And then he said, it seemed to me as if I went out to the horizon of the cosmos where the past, the present, and the future coexisted, just like Carl Jung had said, another extraordinary intellectual. So those are two top docs, two top doctors in academia at the height of their field, who both said, I was there, I went out there. And Carl Jung experienced that in 1944, well before Susskind and 't Hooft discovered the holographic string theory in the early 1990s. Eben Alexander had his experience after I think it was in 2008, and he put the book out in 2012. But it doesn't seem to me that he was aware of holographic string theory before he had that experience. If you look at the end of Plato's Republic, he talks about the soldier named E.R., waking up on his own funeral pyre and recalling his journey in the afterlife, where he saw the outermost sphere of the universe. They describe it as a hemisphere, but at any rate, the outermost border of the universe where souls were attached to these threads of destiny, which they carried from the outermost horizon inward through the concentric spheres down to Earth. And we'll see in the Upanishads also, they talk about the information describing all of the material universe being interwoven at the outermost ether sphere, earth, water, air, fire, ether. So, as I pointed out, the history of 20th century academic physics resulted in this idea that is very similar to the ancient cosmologies of the Greeks and the Indians, which is furthermore given support by near-death experience from top docs like Carl Jung and Eben Alexander. And then there's people who have very similar experiences under the influence of psychedelic drugs, such as LSD and ayahuasca, and there's a lot of research about that. Stanislav Grof, a famous psychiatrist who deals with these kinds of extrasensory experiences, talks about them. So there's a lot of evidence indicating the very thing that Paul Churchland is saying is this, blatherings of the supermarket tabloids. Well, Plato's not a blathering supermarket tabloid author. Neither was Carl Jung, nor was Eben Alexander. So, and so we see here on page 110 and 11, Paul Churchland, he mentions general relativity. He mentions E equals mc squared, which is derived from special relativity. He mentions an electron, which brings up quantum mechanics, which says little particles of matter don't exist unless they're being observed. When they're not being observed, they behave like mathematical waves of probability, which are the probability for where a little particle might appear were that wave, that immaterial wave of potentiality to be observed. These are radically different than the idea of these little ball bearings of unthinking matter extended in space, which is the foundation of Darwinism. This is my main point. So Churchland is arguing these ideas of dualism have all these logical flaws, whereas our materialist argument is very simple. There's one ingredient, matter. It causes everything. It's just not simple. You can't even take away the conscious observer and talk about what matter is in any intelligible way. We saw that with Berkeley. He said he was an empiricist, but he says, what do you actually observe? Ideas, sensations, sights, sounds, touch, and those are ideas in your mind. That's all you ever experience. That's all you ever can experience. Why do you assume that the idea in your mind correlates to something outside of your mind? That is adding an extra ingredient that you never will experience nor can confirm or prove empirically, because empirical observations are just ideas in the mind. Paul Churchland does not bring up that well-known argument of idealism from Berkeley. So it just seems to me that his arguments, even though I appreciate anybody taking the time to discuss this very important problem, and he brings up a lot of the important issues, I don't think he takes them as deeply as he could have, just like I can't take his article as deeply as I could have if I had more time, but I don't. So let's keep moving here. So he'll talk about now property dualism. So that was substance dualism. There's this immaterial substance unextended in space that has consciousness. He's saying that doesn't seem likely. But then he says that the fact that doesn't seem likely to him, this has moved many dualists to articulate still less extreme forms of dualism in hopes of narrowing further the gap between theory and available evidence. This is page 111, right-hand column, property dualism. The basic idea of the theories under this heading is that while there is no substance to be dealt with here beyond the physical brain, the brain has a special set of properties possessed by no other kind of physical object. It is these special properties that are non-physical, hence the term property dualism. So then he'll break that down into three types of property dualism: epiphenomenalism, and then what he'll call the interactionist property dualism, and then we'll call elemental property dualism over on page 113. So the epiphenomenalism is the argument that consciousness is an epiphenomenon, a byproduct of a material nervous system, that it's completely created by the workings of the brain. However, the consciousness that is produced by the brain cannot be reduced to the material ingredients and processes from which it emerged. This is property dualism. We can't explain the fact that we experience the color red or an emotion. These conscious experiences defy the ability to define them in strictly materialist terms. That's what the epiphenomenalists, they would still believe in Darwinism, the material origin of life and everything else. They're just saying, we don't know what consciousness is. We'll need a new science to tell us what it is. And they also say that these thoughts and emotions, they have no causal influence on the material brain that produces them. They are produced by the brain. They cannot be reduced to the brain, nor can they cause the brain to do anything. They are, what was the term? Causally impotent. And he explains, well, imagine you're a neuroscientist and you see that everything here in your brain can be, is ruthlessly selected for during the brain's long evolutionary history. In some, the seat of human behavior appears entirely physical in its constitution, in its origins, and in its internal activities. On the other hand, our neuroscientist has the testimony of her own introspection to account for as well. She can hardly deny that she has experiences, beliefs, and desires, nor that they are connected in some way with her behavior. One bargain that can be struck here is to admit the reality of mental properties as non-physical properties, but demote them to the status of impotent epiphenomena that have nothing to do with the scientific explanation of human and animal behavior. Okay, so it's the bargain. We have these conscious experiences. It seems difficult to describe them in physical terms, so they can't be physical. Nevertheless, they're causally impotent. They can't have any effect on the brain that produces them. So then, some don't like this idea of causal impotence, and so this view, which we may call interactionist property dualism, differs from the previous view in only one essential respect. The interactionist asserts that mental properties do indeed have causal effects on the brain and thereby on behavior. So there's this interaction. The brain causes these non-material thoughts and emotions to emerge, which interact with the physical brain. So I'm going to just read what he says about that. On the bottom of the right-hand column, page 112, with this much any materialist will agree, but any property dualist makes the further claim that mental states and properties are irreducible in the sense that they are not just organizational features of physical matter, as are the examples cited. They are said to be novel properties beyond prediction or explanation by physical science. This last condition, the irreducibility of mental properties, is an important one, since this is what makes the position a dualist position. But it sits poorly with the joint claim that mental properties emerge from nothing more than the organizational achievements of physical matter. If that is how mental properties are produced, then one would expect a physical account of them to be possible. The simultaneous claim of evolutionary emergence and physical irreducibility is prima facie puzzling. Okay, so then fundamental property dualism, that consciousness is a fundamental element. And he mentions that formerly scientists believed in the ether, that how is light propagated? Sound is propagated on the air, so there must be some propagating medium upon which light is transmitted, the electromagnetic energy. And people said, oh, maybe it's what the ancients formerly called the ether. But then they discover there is no ether, that light is travels at an absolute speed, no matter how fast or slow the source of light is moving, and no matter how fast or slow or in what direction the detector, the light speed detector, is moving in relation to each other, whenever you measure the speed of light, it will always come out the same, 186,200 and something miles per second. How is that possible? If you're in a car driving at 50 miles per hour and a car driving 100 miles per hour drives past you and you shot a radar gun at that car, from your perspective, that car is moving at 50 miles per hour because you're moving at half that car's speed. But if you had some radar gun that could detect the speed of light, and you measured the light from the head beams of the car going 100 miles per hour, and you're going 50 miles per hour, you should expect, oh, that car's light is going to go at the speed of light plus 50 miles per hour from my perspective, but it won't. You'll perceive that car's light, headlights producing light, a light beam that travels at the exact same speed as your light beams, which produce this light beam that goes at the exact same speed of someone traveling in the opposite direction. No matter what direction you're traveling, and no matter what direction the source of light is traveling and how fast, you will always measure any light beam as traveling at exactly the same speed. That has enormous implications for philosophy, because from a photon's perspective, one of the implications is that the past, the present, and the future are occurring simultaneously. If you could travel at the speed of light, you would see all of the light from behind you condensed into a single point at a dark tunnel in front of you. That single point would contain the past, present, and future of the entire universe, which is very similar to a near-death experience, the light at the end of the tunnel. I don't think many people know that, according to Einstein, traveling close to the speed of light produces the exact same thing that people say they perceive during a near-death experience, whereas my whole life flashed before my eyes. I was being drawn towards this point of light, the end of a dark tunnel that contained all knowledge. So my claim is, okay, if that is what people experience, it's very well known that many people have had that experience, or at least they believe they've had it. It makes sense if you remember Immanuel Kant. Kant, and this is another thing that Paul Churchland, he doesn't bring up, Kant's idea of space and time and causality. Space, what is space? It's not an empirically observable physical thing, nor is time, nor is this idea of cause and effect. Space is an a priori category of your own mind. It's a categorizing principle that takes the flux of sense perceptions and organizes them in a context of space, in a context of time. It links them together in relationships of cause and effect. So space isn't physical. Space is mental. Okay. If space is mental, then when your mind leaves the body, the concept of space is still there. According to our best physics today, space itself expands at an exponential rate. Start off, it expands slowly, but ever more rapidly. So if your mind is space, when you die, your mind leaves the body. Now you are space. The nature of space is to expand outward at an exponential rate until achieving the speed of light out at the horizon of the cosmos. If you were to expand near the speed of light, you would perceive all of the universe condensed into a single point at the end of a dark tunnel. So these correlations between near-death experiences and 20th century physics, they seem to me too precise to be accidental, especially given Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli making the prediction that we should look for these kinds of parallels between psychology and physics, because mind and matter are just different manifestations of the same fundamental essence, which they call the unus mundus, or the self, in which I equate with the singularity and its encompassing horizon, as I've said before. Okay, so when he mentioned the ether, that outermost sphere of the universe where string theorists say all the past, present, and the future is superimposed, that outermost sphere is what Plato and the Hindus called the ether sphere, where the past, present, and future are superimposed, just like this atheist, materialist, scientist Susskind says. All right, so then he goes arguments for dualism, and one is the religious argument. My religion tells me that. Another one, he says, is introspection. Well, I'm experiencing my consciousness, and it seems totally different from anything that's material. And then his argument from irreducibility. So I think I will. All right, so the argument from religion, he's saying, okay, but, oh yeah, the argument from also the parapsychological phenomena. So I already went over some of this parapsychological phenomena, especially near-death experiences. And there's other, and I just don't want to risk turning this video off, but I have a couple queued up here. at the University of Virginia, Division of Perceptual Studies. They've been studying near-death experiences and the study of the mind and body problem. So that's one respected academic source for that. Up in Canada, the inventor of the God helmet, Michael Persinger, he's an atheist and a materialist, but he considers electromagnetic energy or light to be material, and it has these properties that I was talking about. At any rate, he's demonstrated telepathy under laboratory conditions. That I've seen him give talks about this, and I think he's got some good evidence for that. But he's not a dualist. He believes that consciousness can be reduced to information conserved at the outermost sphere of the planet Earth, which is very similar to Leonard Susskind's idea of holographic information conservation at any two-dimensional surface area of any three-dimensional sphere. Rupert Sheldrake, he's another academic who's talking about these kinds of things like telepathy. He wrote one book, and I saw a documentary about it, dogs that know when their owners are coming home. He had a camera at dogs in their homes, and then he would have people leave their job at various times, different times throughout the day, and his evidence showed that no matter when the owner decided to leave, some of these dogs would get up and get ready and wait by the door. So how did the dog know that? So just some examples, because he mentions, show me some of this evidence for parapsychological phenomena. All right, so, and he says, oh, so you appeal to religion? Well, that's not that wise. Look how much scientists have had to fight against religious prejudice. Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for urging, the idea of an enormous universe with life on other planets. Galileo was forced by threat of torture in the Vatican's basement to recant the idea that the Earth goes around the sun. And he says, all right, in the age of the Earth and the evolution of life, we're forced to fight an uphill battle against religious prejudice, even in an age of supposed enlightenment. So the evolution of life was forced to fight an uphill battle. It hasn't been proven. I mean, you can't produce life out of material particles, and Churchland's understanding of what a material particle is very weak. Mine is very weak too, okay, but it's stronger than his. I mean, I've read what the actual physicists say, and I know the wave-particle paradox of matter that he doesn't mention, from the two-slit experiment, and the fact that the past, present, and future coexist, how that undermines the very foundation of the idea of an evolution of three-dimensional space. He doesn't mention that. Einstein did. Penrose did. So, he's attacking my worldview, so I'm fighting back. It's nothing personal against Churchland. It's just the way. So if I was to answer this, you kind of can get an idea of how I would answer this question. I'm just presenting this because what I'm saying here, we're touching on the fundamental issues that are brought up throughout these articles in this part 4 of our book called Reality. So let me go back to this video to make sure I didn't click it off, which would be horrible. Okay. All right, so he's saying, for all these reasons, professional scientists and philosophers concerned with the nature of mind generally do their best to keep religious appeals out of their discussions entirely. But I don't think that's wise because, if you look at these ancient religious worldviews and compare them to the cutting edge of physics, you'll find a lot of parallels that are, I think, helpful in searching for the truth. So then, the argument from introspection is a much more interesting argument. This is page 115, since it tries to appeal to the direct experience of every man. But the argument is deeply suspect in that it assumes that our faculty of inner observation or introspection reveals things as they really are in their innermost nature. This assumption is suspect because we already know that our other forms of observation, sight, hearing, touch, and so on, do no such thing. The red surface of an apple does not look like a matrix of molecules reflecting photons at certain critical wavelengths, but that's what it is. Okay, he's going to go on to say the sound of a flute isn't a sinusoidal compression wave. Is the red surface of an apple, is red really just a matrix of molecules reflecting photons? The red surface. He's leaving out an essential ingredient of the color red, and that is the conscious experience of it. It's not just a matrix of molecules reflecting photons. A matrix of molecules reflecting photons can't even be said to exist unless somebody observes it. That's quantum mechanics. That's also Bishop Berkeley's idealism. According to quantum mechanics, they wanted to know, are particles points, little particles, or are they waves, like liquid? And so they shot particles at between these two slits. They had a wall with two tiny slits, and behind that a solid wall. The two slits were very close together. If they're particles, they'll go through both slits and line up in two lines directly behind the slits. If they're waves, they'll go through both slits at once, create two new waves from each slit, which will radiate out and ripple into each other and create an interference pattern of dark and light bands. Dark bands being where the waves cancel each other out, the light bands being where they amplify each other. Well, when they shot these electrons or any other atomic particles through these two slits, if they weren't observing which slit it went through, then they were detected on the back screen as little particle hits. But the weird thing was that the particles didn't line up directly behind the two slits. You might have a particle way to the right, up, to the top left, and after an hour, the little individual particle hits accumulated into the same pattern that a wave would have created had it gone through all at once. That is the craziest thing. What does that mean? So they took an electron microscope to see which slit it actually went through, and when they did that, they went directly through the slits like well-behaved little particles and lined up into direct lines right behind the slits. When they were being observed, they went through the slit as a tiny little particle. They were always detected as a tiny particle by the observing screen. But when they weren't being observed going through the two slits, they apparently went through as this immaterial wave of probability that split up into two mathematical waves of probability that finally collapsed when they were observed by the detector screen. So that, the fundamental ingredient of Darwinian evolution is the little unthinking particle of matter, which does not exist according to quantum mechanics. It only exists as a point in space when it's being observed. When it's not being observed, it behaves like a potential point that might appear in this wave formation that stretches out to infinity. But it's most likely will be located at the peak or the valley. Again, I don't have a degree in physics. I've only read what the experts write for the people who want to know about these kinds of things. But my point is that Paul Churchland apparently has not read those kinds of books, because if he had, I don't think he would what appears to me to be naively, and even, I'm sure he must have read Berkeley, but you're going to say, red is the surface of a matrix of molecules. Well, it's a matrix of molecules interacting with a conscious being. These are the secondary qualities that John Locke talked about. The primary qualities would be the structure of it, this extension in space, its motion through space, and then the way that those primary qualities interact with the primary qualities of our sense organs creates the secondary qualities of our conscious observation. But Paul Churchland doesn't seem to bring in that extra level of analysis. He says the sound of the flute does not sound like a sinusoidal compression wave. See how educated I am, I can't even pronounce that. Train in the atmosphere, but that's what it is. The warmth of the summer air does not feel like the mean kinetic energy of millions of tiny molecules, but that's what it is. Okay, it's not what it is. Warmth is a conscious experience that's created when these tiny little particles hit our skin, and the more of them that hit more quickly, the more warmth we feel. But he's leaving out precisely the important point that we're discussing here, consciousness. All right, so the argument from introspection is therefore entirely without force unless we can somehow argue that the faculty of introspection is quite different from all our other forms of observation. So he's saying our eyes don't tell us what's really there. We see a red apple. We don't see all these matrix of molecules. Our ears don't tell us what's really there. We hear a nice flute music. We don't see these compression waves traveling through the air or hear compression waves. So why, when we use our introspection and we perceive a thinking self, should we think that we're perceiving what's really there? It's not some simple, indivisible thinking being that our introspection does perceive that, but it's more likely caused by this intricate machinery of the brain. If our eyes can't see the intricate matrix of molecules that produce, that reflect the photons that produce light, why would we suspect that our introspective organ can perceive what's really there? Instead, it averages it over and gives us this fiction of an enduring immaterial self. That's what Churchland is saying, but I'm not agreeing with him, obviously. Here's another question I have. He says that the argument from introspection is therefore entirely without force, unless we can somehow argue that the faculty of introspection is quite different from all other forms of observation. Our other forms of observation each have a material bodily organ. Our sight comes from the organ of the eye. Our sense of smell comes from the organ of the nose. We can hear through the ear. We touch through the skin. We taste through the tongue. Well, what's the organ, the physical organ of introspection? Descartes talked about the pineal gland in the center of the brain, but at any rate, that's a fundamental issue I think Churchland should bring up. Is introspection just a sixth sense, like the Hindus and the Buddhists believe? If so, what physical organ does it use to observe inwardly? Okay, so then he goes, the argument from irreducibility presents a more serious challenge, but here also its force is less than first impression suggests. Consider first our capacity for mathematical reasoning. Then he'll go on to bring up the idea of the calculator. Calculators can do mathematical reasoning, at least the computational side of it, he says, better than humans can, but then I say, yeah, but a calculator is programmed by a rational human, so it doesn't prove that machines can do mathematical reasoning. It proves that machines can be programmed by humans who have the ability of mathematical reasoning to react in certain ways, but I'd have to study that more and think about it more deeply. Like I said, I just simply don't have time to get that deeply into these readings as I would like to. Then he says, okay, what about the argument from telepathy and telekinesis? He's saying they might happen, but they could still be given physical explanations. So this is page 116, the left-hand column. The materialist can already suggest a possible mechanism for telepathy. For example, on his view, thinking is an electrical activity within the brain, but according to electromagnetic theory, such changing motions of electric charges must produce electromagnetic waves radiating at the speed of light in all directions, so that electromagnetic waves radiating from the brain at the speed of light could account for telepathy, he's saying. He says, I don't believe it, but it's possible, and a materialist could explain it. And that is how Persinger from Laurentian University explains telepathy through this electromagnetic information transmission. But when he mentions there the speed of light, I wish he had developed that a little bit more, because the speed of light, the discovery of the absolute nature of the speed of light, indicates the past, the present, and the future coexist, which undermines the very foundation of the idea of material evolution. Very important point. And as I said, Einstein wrote about that. So did Sir Roger Penrose, who does believe that in consciousness permeating the universe. So it's not, there are people at the height of academia who are not physicalists, who are not materialists. You wouldn't think so to read a lot of these materialists' articles, but it is not as definitely today. The presupposition is consciousness comes from Darwinian evolution of unthinking material particles, but that is starting to give way, I think, more and more, because people like me, and I'm following a lot of other people, just constantly pester the paradigm. It's like, how can this possibly be? These fundamental ingredients of your paradigm do not exist. So how is it that I'm to accept the rest of it? This whole idea of consciousness coming from unthinking matter. All right, and there's two levels of Darwinism. There's the origin of consciousness, and then there's the evolution of life. So you could still say that living biological forms evolve from one species to the next, and say that consciousness is pervasive. It's the fundamental essence of everything. That's not a contradiction. But to claim that consciousness comes from these random combinations of little unthinking inert particles, that is a contradiction, because those little particles don't exist unless they're being observed. Do they need to have a conscious observer? These are all kinds of questions, but Berkeley will point out that whether they exist without being observed is impossible to prove, because you would have to observe them to do the experiment. All we ever really experience is consciousness. We don't experience matter, and we never can. And yet physicalists, materialists like Paul Churchland still maintain that everything comes from these little unthinking bits of matter. All right, so the arguments against dualism now, I'll go on to. This is his. And his argument is simplicity. He's saying that the materialist postulates only one kind of substance, physical matter, and one class of properties, physical properties, whereas the dualist postulates two kinds of matter and or two classes of properties. And to no explanatory advantage charges the materialist. This is not yet a decisive point against dualism, since neither dualism nor materialism can yet explain all of the phenomena to be explained. But the objection does have some force, especially since there's no doubt at all that physical matter exists, while spiritual matter remains a tenuous hypothesis. All right, I just completely reject what he just said there. He says, especially since there's no doubt at all that physical matter exists. All right, George Berkeley showed that there's no doubt at all that you can't ever experience physical matter. It's impossible. How could you? Experience is consciousness. You can't ever experience physical matter. You could never prove that it does exist, even if it does. And the best science of the 20th century tells us that physical matter, in the way that Churchland is describing it, does not exist. Objectively existing inert matter extended in space does not exist. There's no such thing. You would think, writing at this level, that most basic level, I feel like I'm going over the top here, but when you say something like that there's no doubt at all, that's just so palpably false. There's an enormous amount of doubt that physical matter exists. There can be no doubt that consciousness exists, because that's all you ever experience. Doubt itself is made of consciousness. That's what Rene Descartes pointed out. I can't be certain of anything, he says. I must doubt everything. There could be some evil genie forcing me to think even the laws of math are true, that I have a body. Everything's just an illusion. I doubt everything. That leaves me with one certain indubitable truth. I think. Doubting is thinking. I think, therefore I must exist. I think, therefore I am. That cannot be doubted. I mean, you could doubt that I think, therefore I am, that thinking proves you exist, but the fact that thinking is going on seems indubitable, but that physical matter exists is very highly doubtful. Okay, so he's arguing for the simplicity of the materialist worldview, but I mean, the most simple means not compounded of parts. There's only one simple thing known to exist in the realm of physics, and that's a gravitational singularity. It has no parts. It truly is a point of infinite density. That simple thing, I say, is what we call the soul or the mind. It's the source of thought, but it's also the source of matter. So there's a truly simple worldview. Mind and matter both come from the simplest thing of all, a point of infinite density, which is called the gravitational singularity, which is already the theory of the origin of the universe that Churchland accepts, the Big Bang. He just hasn't accounted for the philosophical implications of the levels of the evolution of physics in the 20th century. Okay, so I'm just going to, we've gone over all of his arguments, and I already started with the conclusion, which is that he says on page 118, thanks to the fossil record, comparative anatomy, and the biochemistry of proteins and nucleic acids, there is no longer any significant doubt on this matter, that life comes from unthinking bits of matter. And I've given you many, many reasons why there is doubt about that origin of consciousness. And he concludes on page 119, the very last paragraph. Arguments like these have moved most, but not all, of the professional community to embrace some form of materialism. This has not produced much unanimity, however, since the differences between the several materialist positions are even wider than the differences that divide dualism. And I'll end it there because it's an hour and 20 minutes, which is a normal class period.